Hello readers, I'm Amy and today we are talking about possibly one of my favorite books of 2020. And this whole review is going to be dedicated to Angela from the Literature Science Alliance because this whole review is her fault. I am talking about How Long Till Black Future Month. I have been wanting to pick up N.K. Jemisin for a little while now. I'm hesitant about starting fantasy stuff because I'm liking Brandon Sanderson so far, but fantasy isn't really a genre I explored that much. And just a little while ago, Angela did a review of a bunch of Jemisin's books and talked about where to start with her. And around that time, I also got this book on audio from my library, and I saw this physical copy in Barnes & Noble, and I'm like, oh, well, if it's there, if it's available. So I bought the physical copy, and I am so in love. I don't even know where to start with this. I have a lot of notes that I took in the hopes that I can find out where to start with this review, but I don't know. We'll see where it goes. The first thing that I have written here is that this book is a love letter to culture and diversity. So this whole book has stories that are somewhere on the spectrum of fantasy or sci-fi. Some of them are heavier on fantasy, some of them are heavier on sci-fi. Generally, I would categorize this book as sci-fi. The title itself, How Long Till Black Future Month, is from one of her essays. The essay is not featured in this book, but the name of her essay was used for this book, and I think that was a good way to go with this because it can get you interested in exploring her writing outside of this book. And it also it uses the name to address the different diversity and topics that are discussed within here. So through the lens of fantasy and sci-fi, we are exploring Jemisin's love of culture. We're exploring race politics. There's one story that I believe it's the one that I was talking to Angela about that might actually be part of The City We Became, because it's like the love letter to New York. And this story kind of takes racism and makes it magical. So we actually have a couple of stories about that, where you have a black person and a white person with very different magical backgrounds and kind of magical cultures, and they're fighting one another. And there's also the slavery narrative in there, and I thought that was really interesting. We have some characters of different genders here as well. We have people of different cultural backgrounds within the Black community, which was really awesome to see. One of my favorite stories in here, I believe it was the second story. Really, the first two are probably my top favorite stories, but there wasn't really a bad story in this book. But the very first story is, a reaction to an Ursula K. Le Guin short story. And I don't remember what that one was called, but it's basically about a utopia and how a utopia is created and what makes a society a utopia. And it's by no means perfect, but I still think it fits into that utopian idea of a perfect society, or a society on their way to being perfect and equal and accepting. And it was just really, really beautiful. And then the second story, the one that really got my attention and just really solidified this author for me already, it was basically this love letter to food. You have this mysterious stranger show up at a restaurant with these ingredients, and the cook needs to try and follow this complex recipe. And just the way she's talking about her history with food and her thoughts around food, it's just a love letter to food, and I loved that. A lot of these stories are love letters to one topic or another, and her passion for storytelling just really shows through in each of her stories. They were each very different from one another while still making a good cohesive collection, and I felt that the short stories as a collection were really well balanced. They went really well together. And not that I've read any of other Jemisin's work, but looking at the video that Angela made on her other works, which I think this is the one book that Angela hasn't read yet, and then looking at my experience with reading this book, I do think that this book is a great place to start if you are nervous about Jemisin like I am. I also got the Broken Earth trilogy that I want to read eventually, but I've been nervous about the 5th season because I hear that it's good, but it's also really complex and you have to concentrate a lot and it can be tough to understand everything that's going on. So while I'm excited and I'm intrigued, I'm also like, I want to build my way up with this author because I am nervous about starting that. And I think this was a great place to go for my first foray into Jemisin's work, because it just really shows her technique, her different areas of interest. She's a very strong writer. She's a very talented writer. And if you're new to Jemisin, I think this is a great starting point. I've already said that a million different ways. I need to move on. Exploration of colonization and trauma. So as I just stated earlier, we have some exploration of racism and slavery and magic, and I think that gives us a really good idea of the colonization and trauma of Black bodies, and it has a conversation on that, but it also doesn't really feel like it's throwing anything in your face. Some stories, some books that mention race or gender can feel like they're really trying to push this idea at you instead of having it feel integrated into the story, and in the case of this book, I feel like the colonization, the trauma, the racism, the gender politics were integrated really well and felt like they fit, rather than kind of being outliers where she stuffed some politics in there. So I really liked that. It was a very smooth integration for that. What else? We have a couple of stories talking about witchcraft, which was really interesting, and again, that just really goes deep diving into different kinds of Black cultures. Storytelling. So there are some stories in here that almost read more like a fairy tale rather than like a short story or novella. So I guess I don't know how else to describe it except like a fairy tale, but that kind of third person sort of setup that's just like a once upon a time sort of thing. There's a couple stories like that, and really this whole book is a celebration of storytelling. Something else I would like to discuss with this book is the concept of Afrofuturism. I've heard a couple of different terms. I think there's Afrofuturism and African futurism, which I think are separate from one another, and then African Jujuism or Afro-Jujuism is another one. For right now, until I learn more about those ideas, I'm going to just say Afrofuturism. That's something that I really want to bring up with this book. So there's a couple of different definitions, and most of the ones that I've read, especially the academic definitions, can be really, really confusing. Generally, what I found, there was an article in the New York Times that defined Afrofuturism as non-Western mythologies, mysticism, and magical realism with Afrocentricity, modern technology, and science fiction. They have cyborg themes, loosely tribal motifs, and android imagery. Then I also have a quote here from Yatasha L. Womack that says, "But when, even in the imaginary future, people can't fathom a person of non-European descent 100 years into the future, a cosmic foot has to be put down." And I think those two things really helped solidify for me kind of this idea of Afrofuturism, because in reading the definition, there's like a lot of kind of academic jargon that really makes me lose the idea. But my current interpretation of Afrofuturism that I have here is that we're so focused on Black history and finally coming to terms with that and how we have treated them in the past that we're not considering the Black future. We're not concentrating any of our ideas on the Black future. We're like, oh, all this horrible stuff happened to Black people in the past. But there's not a lot of thought or discussion into, well, what about as we go on into the future? And I feel like Afrofuturism is really a celebration of that and being like, here's some science fiction with African people, with Black people in the future, celebrating their different cultures and tribes and histories. And I really like that. If there's one big concept that I came across in my reading so far in 2020 that is my favorite, it would be Afrofuturism, because I'm starting to read a couple of different works with that concept and I'm loving it. And actually, for this term for my graphic design class, one of my weekly projects, I had to find an artist who was doing collage work that I could kind of set my sights on and be like, this person is inspiring to me right now, because this term we're focusing on making a collage just so we can practice layers in Photoshop. And the artist that I came across that I absolutely loved was Kaylin M. I don't remember what their last name was, but in the main article that I read, it was just abbreviated as Kaylin M. But I will put their work up here on the screen. It is amazing. It is so Afrofuturist and so sci-fi and collage-y, and there's all these colors and textures, and I love it, and I found it so inspiring, and I'm hoping to really dive more into their artwork and kind of see how I can incorporate some of those ideas into my own art, or some of those inspirations into my own art as this term goes along, because I think this artist has a lot to teach me. So, with that little deviation and tangent, let's just say that you need to read this book. And I guess that is the one thing, the title of this book can throw people off, I think, because while I appreciate the title and I think it relates to the book really well, whenever you hear How Long Till Black Future Month, like, I honestly thought that this was a nonfiction book of some kind that kind of discussed Black history and the Black future, but ends up, it's a collection of sci-fi and fantasy stories, which caught me off guard, but in a great way. But also, don't be like me going and expecting this to be some sort of nonfiction. Jemisin is very much a fantasy sci-fi writer, and that's what this book is, and she really celebrates that, and I love it. That is all that I have for you today, so please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media as I obsess about my further journey into reading an Afrofuturism in 2020, and I will see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends.